Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever stopped to think about who's really shaping the advice on, say, our nation's defense?
Mm-hmm.
Is it always independent expertise, or, are other things potentially influencing it?
It's a really important question.
For years, right, these big think tanks, they've played a huge role in American foreign policy,
Mm-hmm.
especially on something as critical as Ukraine.
Absolutely central.
But there's this analysis out now,
Yeah.
and it uncovers something pretty surprising. Or maybe not surprising, depending on how cynical you are.
Uh-huh.
A huge majority of these groups, and this includes every single one of the top 10 biggest names,
Right.
they get significant funding from defense contractors.
The very companies that profit from military spending and, well, arms sales.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's maybe even more striking is how often the media goes to these specific think tanks.
Yeah, the report mentions that.
Over 7 times more often when they're talking about the U.S. military side of the Ukraine war.
7 times. That's quite a disparity.
So it makes you ask, right, are we getting objective advice? Or is it a narrative that, maybe unintentionally, benefits the defense industry, pushing for more intervention?
It certainly raises that possibility.
And then, just as we're thinking about that money trail, the Pentagon throws a curveball. Completely different kind of influence shift.
Really dramatic policy change.
Yeah, they're pulling back engagement based on ideology, not dollars, calling some groups America last.
It's aimed at aligning leadership with certain values, but it's causing a lot of ripples.
It's definitely sparking questions about open dialogue, about who gets a seat at the table now.
And who will ultimately shape defense policy going forward.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into this whole tangle, this web of influence in foreign policy. We'll look at who's advising the government, how money might be shaping that advice, subtly or not so subtly.
Right.
And then we'll get into this really dramatic, recent Pentagon policy change. It's definitely shaking things up. Okay, so let's kick things off just thinking about think tanks generally, their traditional role. We tend to see them as these neutral, authoritative places, right? Giving expert opinions.
That's the perception, absolutely. Media relies on them, policymakers rely on them. They're seen as the unbiased brain trust.
But your point is, it might not always be that straightforward.
Oh, yeah. There's a growing amount of research showing that who funds these places can significantly influence what they publish, their analysis, their commentary.
And it's not just like gentle nudges.
It doesn't seem to be. It can apparently range from direct censorship or maybe self-censorship, not wanting to upset a major donor, or even in some cases sort of pay for research setups.
Right.
And the end result is the viewpoints that align with the biggest donors, well, they can start to dominate the whole policy debate.
So other perspectives get crowded out.
Potentially, yeah. It can narrow what's even considered a valid expert opinion.
And one huge area where we might see this playing out is U.S. involvement in Ukraine.
A prime example, given the stakes.
We're talking, around $48.7 billion in military spending approved for Ukraine by the U.S.
A massive amount. Historically significant.
And yet it seems like relatively few think tanks have really dug into that critically, questioned that record spending level.
That's what the Quincy Institute analysis highlights. They found some really striking numbers.
Like what?
Well, for example, they looked at 27 top foreign policy think tanks where they could actually identify the donors.
Okay.
And 21 of those 27, that's 77%, got funding from the defense sector.
Wow, over 3/4.
But then, if you narrow it down to just the top 10 ranked foreign policy think tanks,
the
figure jumps to 100%.
Get out. All 10.
Every single one. Receiving funding either directly from the Pentagon or from defense contractors.
So the most influential voices are all financially linked to the industry that benefits from military spending.
That's what the data suggests. And it really blurs the lines, Is policy being driven purely by strategy, or are commercial interests creeping in? It potentially shapes a public narrative that leans towards more intervention.
And you mentioned this isn't just stuff buried in academic reports. It spills into the public conversation, the news you and I see.
That's right. That's a key finding.
How does that show up?
The analysis looked at media articles specifically about U.S. military involvement in Ukraine. And it found that media outlets cited think tanks that get defense industry money 85% of the time.
85%. So the vast majority of the expert quotes we read
came from organizations with financial ties to the defense sector. They were more than 7 times as likely to quote a defense-funded think tank as one that isn't.
So you have to ask, what kind of commentary are we mostly hearing? And who's really setting the terms of the public debate on this massive conflict?
Exactly. For you, the listener, it means the voices you hear most often might have this underlying financial connection.
Okay, so we see the money connection. We see they get quoted a lot. But does it actually change what they recommend? Is there a clear link between the funding and the policy advice on Ukraine?
The analysis argues, yes, absolutely. There's a consistent pattern.
What does that look like?
Well, think tanks with those financial ties to the arms industry, they pretty consistently pushed for policies that would, well, benefit their funders.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, they get defense money. They published an article called Aid to Ukraine, Much More Than Tanks, basically arguing for more U.S. military spending.
Okay.
The Atlantic Council, another one, also defense-funded. They argued tanks are vital, but Ukraine needs much more. They also tended to dismiss diplomatic options. One piece even suggested Ukraine had the right to destroy critical infrastructure in Russia.
Wow, okay. Pretty aggressive stance.
Yeah. Then you have the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. Again, defense funding ties. They argued for, quote, other advanced capabilities, whether longer-range missiles or fourth-generation fighter aircraft.
More weapons.
Right. Saying Ukraine's biggest vulnerability was the amount of assistance. Even the Hudson Institute pushed for Ukraine to take Crimea from Russia using Western weapons.
So a clear pattern emerges. More military aid, more advanced systems, more aggressive postures from the groups taking defense money.
That's what the report documents, yeah. A consistent push in that direction.
Okay, so that's the picture from the defense-funded groups. What about the think tanks that don't take that money? Or take very little? Is their advice actually different?
It really is. The contrast is quite stark.
How so?
Think tanks with little or no defense industry funding, like, say, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, they tended to offer more analytical pieces rather than just calling for more military action.
So less prescriptive.
Exactly. More focus on things like understanding Russia's internal dynamics or suggesting Europe take on more security responsibilities to reduce the U.S. military footprint.
Interesting. Any others?
Human Rights Watch is a good example. They have an explicit policy not to accept funding from weapons makers, given their mission.
Right.
So their focus regarding Ukraine was almost entirely on documenting war crimes, highlighting the impact of specific weapons, like landmines or cluster munitions, on civilians.
So a focus on the human cost, the consequences, rather than the military strategy itself.
Precisely. It shows how a different funding model or a different core mission can lead to a really different analytical lens, a different set of priorities.
Now, we also saw a really interesting move from the Heritage Foundation, didn't we? They're a major conservative think tank.
Yes, that was a significant development, and it adds another layer to this.
What happened there?
Well, Heritage historically did accept funding from defense contractors.
Okay.
But they made a very public decision to stop doing that, to sever those ties.
Why?
Their VP of Communications said it was, quote, to protect our ability to provide independent analysis without even the perception of influence.
A deliberate move towards perceived independence.
Exactly. And interestingly, this shift seemed to be reflected in their publications afterwards. They started challenging some aspects of defense spending, even questioning Ukraine aid packages later on.
So it suggests that making that choice about funding can have a real impact, or at least is intended to signal a real impact on their positions.
It certainly shows that some organizations are wrestling with this perception issue and making conscious choices about it.
But despite these examples, like Heritage making a change, the overall picture is still one of, well, a lack of transparency, right?
That's a major problem, yes. Many think tanks still don't disclose all their donors publicly.
And the media often doesn't mention these potential conflicts of interest when they quote an expert from one of these groups.
Rarely. So that transparency gap is critical. It means you, the public, and even policymakers might not have the full context about who's potentially influencing the advice being given.
Okay, so that's the money angle. Financial ties potentially shaping the conversation. But now let's pivot to this other major development. What happens when the government itself, the Pentagon, starts picking and choosing who it listens to based on ideology?
Right. It's a fascinating and, frankly, unprecedented shift.
What exactly did they announce?
The Pentagon, under Secretary Pete Hegseth, put out a directive. They're suspending participation in all think tank and research events indefinitely until further notice.
All events. That sounds sweeping.
It's a huge departure from how things have always been done. Decades of practice.
Then what's the official reason?
The stated goal is, and I'm quoting here, ensure the Department of Defense is not lending its name and credibility to organizations, forums, and events that run counter to the values of this administration.
Okay.
And they specifically call out avoiding America Last organizations that promote globalism and hate.
America Last, globalism, hate. That's very strong, very specific ideological language.
Extremely. So where we were just talking about influence via dollars, now the Pentagon seems to be filtering external engagement based on ideological alignment. It's a completely different kind of gatekeeping.
How is that likely to play out? Using that kind of charged language, America Last, globalism, what does that do to the Pentagon's ability to get diverse perspectives?
Well, the immediate fear among many inside the DoD is that it will essentially muzzle the military.
Muzzle them? How?
By severely limiting their ability to talk to policy circles in Washington, get feedback, explain their own thinking.
So it isolates them.
Potentially, yes. It makes it harder to explain policy not just domestically, but also to allies. NATO diplomats have already expressed concern about losing access to these public events where they could normally get a sense of U.S. military thinking.
So it cuts off lines of communication both inwards and outwards.
That's the worry. It reduces those traditional channels for dialogue and information sharing significantly.
And what's the effect been inside the Pentagon itself? Is there clear guidance on how this works, or is it causing confusion?
Reports suggest it's mostly causing chaos and uncertainty.
Really?
Yeah. Officials apparently lack clear instructions on how to apply this new policy day to day. The goal seems to be controlling who says what, where, and when, by making all speaking requests go through multiple layers of bureaucratic approval.
So things grind to a halt.
Pretty much. Events that were already scheduled have apparently been canceled abruptly. It seems like it could really stifle internal discussion and the kind of free exchange of ideas you need for good strategy.
And are there legal or ethical questions being raised about this beyond just the practical headaches?
Oh, definitely. Legal experts are looking at it closely.
What are they saying?
Well, there are concerns about viewpoint discrimination. The idea that the government can't restrict speech just because it disagrees with the viewpoint.
First Amendment?
Potentially, yes. Especially if it's seen as restricting private speech or association. The vagueness of terms like globalism or hate is also a concern.
And procedural issues, too.
Right. Questions about whether they followed the Administrative Procedure Act, which dictates how federal agencies have to go about making new rules.
So the bigger picture criticism is that it cuts off valuable external knowledge.
Exactly. That it isolates the DoD, hinders learning, reduces innovation, and ultimately could even undermine national security by narrowing the range of perspectives they consider.
And it's so interesting, like you said, because the previous big debate around think tanks was all about money and transparency.
Precisely. It was about defense contractor funding.
And now the focus from the Pentagon itself is purely ideological alignment. A totally different conversation. Okay, let's bring the Heritage Foundation back into this. We talked about their funding shift, but how do they fit into this new landscape of ideological alignment? They're obviously a major conservative player.
Hugely influential, yes. They've long been a leader in the conservative movement in the U.S.
And they're involved in Project 2025.
They're really at the forefront of it. Project 2025 is this massive plan, a blueprint, essentially, for how to reshape the federal government, consolidate executive power, and implement right-wing policies very quickly if there's a change in administration.
So they're actively planning for a potential shift in government power.
Very actively. It's a comprehensive effort.
And didn't their stance on Ukraine aid also shift pretty dramatically? How does that connect to all this?
Yes, that shift is really notable, and it ties directly into this ideological current we're seeing.
What was the change?
Heritage Action, which is their political advocacy arm, had initially supported military aid to Ukraine.
Okay.
But then in May 2022, they did a complete reversal. They came out against a big $40 billion aid package.
And their reasoning?
Their stated reason was that it puts America last.
There's that phrase again.
Exactly. The same kind of America first anti-globalism language that Secretary Hegseth is now using in the Pentagon's policy.
And that shift within Heritage wasn't universally popular internally.
No, apparently it led to some high-profile resignations. Key foreign policy and defense experts left the foundation over it.
So it really highlights this internal tension, this ideological realignment happening.
It does. And Heritage's shift mirrors the language and apparent ideology behind the Pentagon's new restrictions. It shows how powerful this America First current has become in shaping policy debates and even internal think tank dynamics.
So it's this really complex situation. You've got think tanks like Heritage saying, we're rejecting defense money for independence.
Right.
But at the same time, the Pentagon is saying, we're rejecting certain think tanks based on their ideology, their perceived lack of America First alignment.
Exactly. It's like two different battles over influence being fought simultaneously, one over financial ties, the other over ideological purity.
So let's try and pull these threads together. We've really explored two related, but I guess distinct stories about influence in defense policy today. On one side, you have that long-running concern about defense industry money, how it might shape what think tanks recommend, especially as we saw in the Ukraine debate, where the most quoted voices often have those financial links.
Right. The potential for a commercially driven narrative.
And then on the other side, you have this very sudden, very dramatic move by the Pentagon itself, cutting ties based purely on ideology, aiming for this specific America First foreign policy.
Yeah, a move towards ideological gatekeeping by the government institution itself.
And stepping back, this isn't just, some academic debate about who funds who or who talks to whom.
Not at all. It goes right to the heart of where the information comes from, the analysis that our leaders use to make critical national security decisions.
And how we, the public, understand these really complex global events. It affects what options are even put on the table.
Precisely. It shapes the entire landscape of possibility.
So it boils down to this tension, doesn't it, between different kinds of influence. Does this new Pentagon policy bring, needed clarity? Does it align the military with what the administration sees as core national values?
That's the argument for it, I suppose.
Or does it risk just walling off the military, isolating it from different ideas, from valuable expertise, even from critical feedback?
And potentially leading to a less informed, maybe less adaptable defense strategy in a world that's changing incredibly fast. That's the risk.
So what stands out most to you in all of this? When you consider these layers, the money, the media citations, the new ideological tests, how can we, just as regular people trying to stay informed, possibly figure out what's objective truth in this world of foreign policy and national security? It feels incredibly complicated.